It was a bright morning in Los Angeles and Daniel had just returned from his long night shift at the hospital. He worked as a nurse and his schedule often left him exhausted, yet he always carried a smile. On that particular morning Daniel found the street outside his apartment building unusually crowded. Most of the usual spots were taken and he was left with only one option. The space right outside a neat white painted house with roses blooming in the front yard. It was a public road and Daniel had parked there before without trouble, so he pulled in and locked his car. As he walked away he noticed the front door open. Out stepped an older woman with sharp eyes and neatly tied silver hair. She looked straight at Daniel and spoke firmly. "No parking outside my house," she said. Daniel stopped in his tracks, a little confused. He glanced at the curb. There was no private driveway. No sign that said reserved. It was just like every other piece of road on the block. Daniel replied softly, "I am sorry ma'am, but this is a public road and I did not think it would bother anyone." The woman crossed her arms. "It bothers me," she said. "My husband always liked this spot and now he is gone, but I still want it free." Daniel could have argued. He could have reminded her of the law. Instead he simply nodded and walked on. Inside his heart he felt a sting. He worked long hours to help strangers in pain, and yet in his own neighborhood he was greeted with hostility. That evening when Daniel returned from his shift he found a small note tucked under his windshield. It read, "Please do not park here again." Daniel sighed. He did not want conflict. So for the next few weeks he made sure to avoid that space even when it was the only one open. Sometimes he had to park blocks away and walk in the cold. Yet each time he passed by the white painted house he noticed the woman standing by the window watching. Daniel's friends told him to fight back. They said he had every right to park there. But something in him hesitated. He sensed loneliness in the woman's eyes. She looked not angry but tired, as though she carried stories untold. So instead of anger Daniel began to leave small gestures. One morning he placed a single rose on her gate taken from the grocery store on his way home. He did not write his name. Another time when trash bins rolled onto the street after a storm he pulled them back neatly against her fence. Weeks passed and winter turned to spring. Daniel continued his quiet acts without expecting thanks. Then one day as he walked past her garden the woman opened the door again. This time her voice was not sharp. She asked, "Are you the one leaving flowers?" Daniel felt nervous but nodded. She smiled faintly. "My name is Margaret," she said. "My husband John planted those roses long ago. He passed away last year and I thought if I kept the space empty it would feel like he was still here." Daniel listened. Margaret spoke with a tremor in her voice, yet relief washed over her face as she shared. It was the first time she had spoken of her husband to anyone outside her family. Daniel told her gently that John must have been a man who loved beauty because the roses bloomed brighter than any other on the block. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She invited Daniel for tea. Inside the house Daniel saw photographs of a life lived fully. Pictures of John in uniform as a young soldier. Pictures of family picnics at the beach. A wedding portrait framed in gold. Margaret poured tea carefully and thanked Daniel for his patience. "Most people would have yelled," she said. "Most would not care about an old woman keeping a space for memories." Daniel smiled. "I see more than just a space," he replied. "I see love that still lives." From that day the tone between them changed. Daniel, still parked elsewhere when he could, yet sometimes Margaret herself waved him to use the space when she saw him tired after long shifts. She began leaving small plates of cookies on his doorstep with notes that read, "For my kind neighbor." Daniel in return mowed her lawn when her back hurt or brought her groceries on stormy days. The neighborhood watched with surprise. They had seen the old woman scold drivers before and now she stood outside chatting warmly with Daniel. Some even joked that he had melted her heart with stubborn kindness. But Daniel never thought of it as a victory. He simply believed that people carry invisible burdens and sometimes what they need is not a fight but a friend. Months rolled by and seasons changed again. Margaret began to share more stories about her life with John. She told Daniel about their first date at a little diner in town. About the time they got lost on a road trip and laughed for hours. About the way he whistled when trimming the roses every Sunday morning. Daniel listened with respect as if each memory were a precious jewel. He realized that the empty parking spot had been her way of holding on to the past. She feared that if someone else took it then the memories would fade. Daniel gently helped her see that memories do not live in empty spaces but in hearts that remember. Slowly Margaret began to accept his words. She even encouraged him to park freely outside her house. She said John would have liked to know that a young man who cared for others rested his car under the roses he had once planted. One evening as the sun set golden across the neighborhood Margaret brought out a photo album. She showed Daniel the last picture taken of John in the garden. She placed the album in his hands and said, "I want you to see how full his smile was." Daniel looked at the photo and felt a deep respect for a man he had never met. He told Margaret, "Your love kept his smile alive." By the end of that first year, what began as a small conflict had turned into something unexpected. A bond grew between a tired nurse and a grieving widow. Neighbors who once avoided Margaret now saw her sitting with Daniel on the porch sharing laughter. They realized that kindness had transformed not only one relationship but the spirit of the entire street. Daniel reflected often on how it all began with a simple choice. He could have chosen anger, but instead he chose patience. That choice did not just spare him from conflict, it gave him a friend and gave Margaret comfort in her loneliness. The parking spot outside the white-painted house no longer felt like forbidden ground. It became a symbol of healing and connection. And for Daniel it became proof that kindness is never wasted. Even when met with hostility at first, it can bloom into something beautiful, just like roses planted long ago that continue to blossom year after year. Summer arrived with warmth and longer evenings, and Daniel noticed how Margaret began to step outside more often. She no longer sat behind the window guarding the empty space. Instead, she placed a chair in the garden and sometimes waved to neighbors passing by. The change was subtle but powerful. It was as if the grief that had weighed her down started to lift. Daniel knew she still missed John deeply, yet he also saw her heart opening again to the world around her. One evening, Daniel returned from the hospital later than usual. His shift had been exhausting and he carried heavy steps. To his surprise, Margaret was sitting on her porch with a tray of iced tea and sandwiches. She called him over. "You need to eat something before you collapse," she said with a gentle smile. Daniel laughed and sat with her. As they ate, Margaret spoke about how lonely nights had been after John passed. She admitted that, at first, she wanted to push everyone away because she feared that letting others close would mean replacing him. Daniel listened carefully and assured her that no one could replace John, yet companionship could help heal the silence. Margaret's eyes softened. Soon their routine formed naturally. On days when Daniel had time, he would sit with her in the evenings and they would share stories. Daniel told her about patients who reminded him of resilience. Margaret told him about her childhood by the sea. They discovered that though their lives were decades apart, their hearts shared the same rhythm of compassion. Margaret even began calling him her honorary grandson. One afternoon in autumn, Margaret surprised Daniel with a small box wrapped in faded ribbon. Inside lay an old pocket watch engraved with the initials J and M. She said John carried it for years and she wanted Daniel to have it. At first he refused, saying it was too precious. But Margaret insisted. She told him that John believed time should be shared with those who valued it. She said Daniel had given her time when no one else would, and for that she was grateful. Daniel held the watch close to his heart, overwhelmed by the gesture. Around that time, Daniel faced his own struggles. The hospital was short-staffed and his hours grew longer. There were nights when fatigue nearly broke him. On one such night, as he arrived home, Margaret was waiting with soup and bread. She said, "You care for so many people, Daniel, let someone care for you." He realized then that kindness flowed both ways. What began as his effort to ease her grief had grown into a circle of support. Winter returned, bringing cold winds and long nights. Margaret invited Daniel for Christmas dinner. She decorated her home with lights and set an extra plate at the table. Daniel had not celebrated Christmas properly since his parents passed years ago, and the warmth of her home filled a gap he had long ignored. They exchanged gifts. Daniel gave her a framed sketch of her rose garden that he had drawn during his breaks. Margaret cried when she saw it and hugged him tightly. The neighborhood too noticed the change. Children often stopped by Margaret's yard to look at the roses, and instead of scolding them, she offered cookies. Neighbors who once thought of her as distant now greeted her warmly. All because one man chose patience over conflict. Daniel never sought recognition, but the quiet joy of watching Margaret laugh again was reward enough. As spring approached, Margaret faced a health scare. She fainted one morning while watering the roses. Daniel rushed her to the hospital and stayed by her side through tests and treatments. Thankfully it was not serious, but it reminded both of them how fragile life could be. Margaret told Daniel that she no longer feared the days ahead because she knew she had someone who cared. Daniel promised her that she was never alone. Their bond deepened with every passing week. They celebrated birthdays together. They shared meals. They watched sunsets in silence, knowing words were not always needed. What started as a dispute over a parking spot had turned into a story of family built not by blood but by kindness. 1 year after their first encounter, Daniel parked outside Margaret's house again. This time she walked out not with anger but with a plate of cookies. She laughed and said, "Remember how it all started?" Daniel nodded, smiling. He replied yes with a simple misunderstanding that led to the best friendship I could imagine. They sat on the porch sharing cookies while the roses bloomed behind them. Daniel often thought about the lesson hidden in the journey. He realized that every person carries unseen battles. Margaret had clung to an empty space because it was her way of holding on to love lost. Others might have mocked her or fought her. Yet choosing compassion unlocked not only healing for her but also unexpected joy for himself. He learned that kindness is not weakness. It is quiet strength that turns walls into bridges. Margaret in turn rediscovered hope. She began volunteering at the local library reading stories to children. She said Daniel taught her that life after loss can still hold purpose. The children adored her and the neighbors admired her transformation. Daniel felt proud watching her shine again. By the end of that year Daniel reflected on how much his own life had changed. He was still the same hard-working nurse but now he carried more peace. When stress from work overwhelmed him he looked at the pocket watch Margaret had given him and remembered that time is best spent on love and connection. Margaret too often said that John would be smiling in heaven knowing she had found a friend who treated her with the same respect he once did. She told Daniel, "You were an answer to a prayer I did not even speak." Daniel would always respond, "It was your roses that answered mine." The story of a parking dispute faded into memory but what remained was the bond that grew stronger with each day. Daniel and Margaret proved that even small choices can change lives. What started with 3 simple words, "No parking here," ended with a year full of kindness, love and renewed purpose. And as the roses bloomed again with colors brighter than ever, the street no longer seemed like just a place to park a car. It became a symbol of how compassion can turn strangers into family and how kindness when chosen over anger can truly last a lifetime.